So good afternoon, everyone. Joining us today is Professor John Terry. Professor Terry is an Interdisciplinary Professorial Fellow, and he holds a post that he holds jointly across mathematics, computer science, and the Institute for Metabolism and Systems Research. John's research transcends traditional discipline boundaries, speaking to mathematics, computer science, physics, biology, biomedical, and clinical sciences. He has substantially contributed to approaching 70 pieces of original research and has a very strong track record of research funding. He holds 1 patent with 2 pending and is co-founder of Neuronostics, a startup company established in 2018. John is also passionate science communicator and co-wrote and co-directed Beyond My Control, a unique piece of theatre that brings to life what it's like to have epilepsy, the mathematics behind understanding brain networks, and how this can be used to better diagnose epilepsy. Professor John Terry, thank you very much for joining us today. Please feel free to start when you're ready.
And thanks everyone for joining. Let me just share the screen, get it up into the mode, and away we go. Well, thanks so much for that introduction. And before I get going, as Kathy mentioned in the introduction, I am co-founder of a startup company, Neuronostics. And for reasons of full disclosure, we should say that Neuronostics is developing clinical decision support systems for diagnosis and management of neurological conditions, and in particular epilepsy. So when I talk to you about work where mathematical models can be used to diagnose epilepsy and manage the condition better, please do bear in mind that what I'm saying is through that lens. I should also acknowledge all of our funders who have supported our work. They just provide the money. They don't provide input into study design or any of that kind of thing, but we gratefully acknowledge their support. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is work that I've done in collaboration with Dr. Bessel Goldman, who is also a co-founder and scientific director of Neuronostics. And his work is currently supported by Epilepsy Research UK. He's an emerging leader fellow. And I should say myself that I've recently started an established career fellow funded by the EPSRC here in the UK. So with the disclosure out of the way, we can go through into the talk. And really what I'd like to talk to you about is the journey we've kind of undertaken from theoretical descriptions of networks on a board. And actually here is a picture of a board from my former office in Exeter, probably taken back in about 2012 now, where we were first describing models that could help us understand how different components of a network might contribute to the emergence of seizures, and how that goes all the way through to a clinical decision support system, such as the BioEP system that we're developing at Neuronostics. So hopefully the idea will be to think a little bit about models and what we mean by models, and how do we decide whether a model is fit for purpose, and then to think about the process by which those models can be translated into something that hopefully has clinical meaning. And at the end of the talk, I'll talk a little bit more generally about the company and the journey that we've been on. So before we get into the maths, just to give you a little bit of an overview about epilepsy. So epilepsy is a serious primary brain condition, and it impacts about 1% of the global population. So around 65 million people have epilepsy. And it's mistakenly thought to be easily treated, yet it's actually the 5th leading cause of remedial years of life lost in men and the 8th leading cause in women. So it causes a lot of deaths each year. So on average, around 2,000 in the UK, and similar proportions in most other nations. It's a condition that has very high costs, both medical and societal. So for example, it's the leading cause of unplanned admissions to emergency rooms in developed nations. So in the UK, it's estimated about £300 million a year is spent on people with epilepsy being admitted to A&Es. And in terms of the societal impact, well, productivity is greatly reduced for people with epilepsy, and these people have much lower life opportunities. So their educational attainment is lower, their work opportunities are lower, And functionally and practically, you know, very often people with epilepsy are not allowed to drive cars or to operate heavy machinery. So their life opportunities are greatly reduced. And just to flag that, you know, the COVID pandemic's had a huge impact on people with epilepsy. So here in the UK, there's been research undertaken that has shown there's been a 5,000% rise in people waiting over a year to see a neurologist since the start of the pandemic. And this is, you know, something that makes a move to a different way of diagnosing and managing the condition more important than ever. So just to give you a bit more of an understanding of where we're going to be coming from, I want to talk to you about the challenge of epilepsy diagnosis, or should I say epilepsy misdiagnosis. So as I mentioned, epilepsy is a serious primary brain condition, and it's characterized by the tendency to have recurrent seizures. And these are hypersynchronous bursts of electrical activity. And as such, the EEG, which measures the aggregated electrical activity of the brain using electrodes placed at different locations on the surface of the scalp, is a primary diagnostic tool. And the aim of the EEG is to capture electrical signatures of seizures. So these might be spikes or discharges, or very occasionally seizures themselves. But the trouble is that these features all occur rarely and apparently at random, which means that the vast majority of clinical EEGs, when they're recorded, are negative. So they just look like this sort of data that I've got on this slide here, where if you were to record EEG from someone without epilepsy and someone with epilepsy, this is the sort of data you'd see almost all of the time. And if that's all you see, well, you can't use it in a meaningful way to decide whether or not this is someone with epilepsy. And this leads to delays and uncertainty, and that has significant quality of life impacts for people with suspected epilepsy. And here's some of the stats. You know, the average time to diagnose a case of epilepsy is a year from the first time that that person attends clinic. There's huge uncertainty in the decision-making process. It's estimated that misdiagnosis rates may be as high as 40% in non-specialist settings. And there's a lot of qualitative decision-making. So if you give the same data, the same metadata, the same case history to different experts, very often they'll diagnose different conditions. And that lack of objectivity is, you know, something that also greatly impacts people with epilepsy. And it doesn't just stop there. So once you've got a diagnosis of epilepsy, well, management at the moment is effectively watchful waiting. You essentially put people on anti-epilepsy medications and you wait for a period of time to see whether or not they report the seizures that they were experiencing have gone down in frequency. And as a result of this, there are again delays. So around half the people a year after they're put on drugs still continue to have seizures. There's uncertainty in the process because, as I mentioned, seizures occur quite infrequently for most people anyway. So if you have a period of time where you haven't had a seizure, is that because the medication's working, or it's just because you've had a period of time where you haven't had a seizure? And around 30 to 40% of people never respond effectively to standard anti-epilepsy therapies, and they have to go down alternative routes, and that may involve very invasive procedures such as brain surgery that can be effective for some people. There's other treatments now like deep brain stimulation, also things like focal administration of therapies where you have sort of microneedles implanted in the brain that can actually administer drugs to specific brain regions. These are all potential options, but they're only suitable for a minority of people, which means that there's a great number of people who don't achieve seizure control despite the medication. And these medications have really bad side effects as well. They affect memory, mood. They often induce really significant tiredness. And some people with epilepsy decide, in fact, to stop taking their medications because they find the side effect profile is actually greater, a greater burden than the actual seizures themselves. So all of this together means there are really significant impacts on the quality of life of people with epilepsy. So now I just want to move in to actually talking about models and how we might use models to understand the epileptic brain. Now, it was Norbert Wiener a number of years ago who said the best material model of a cat is another or preferably the same cat. So we could update Norbert's quote in the context of the brain and say that the best material model of a human epileptic brain is another or preferably the same human epileptic brain. So just before the talk started, we were having a chat and someone brought up, is there a genetic component to epilepsy? So if we wanted to think about the best material model being another human epileptic brain, well, the best other human epileptic brain would be the brain of the identical twin of someone with epilepsy. So there we have a genetic replica of the individual. But interestingly, the concordance isn't all that high. So there's definitely a genetic component. So if your identical twin has epilepsy, you're much more likely than chance to also have epilepsy. But it's not a super strong concordance. So it's only around 1 in 4 to 1 in 5. And really intriguingly, the type of epilepsy you have is often completely different to the type of epilepsy that your identical twin has. So as a material model of the brain goes, it's not actually a perfect substitute for the human epileptic brain you wanted to study. But of course, Vina says, preferably the same. So you could actually say, okay, let's take the individual themselves and use them as the model of their own seizures. But even in this case, there are actually quite often real limitations here, because many people with epilepsy have multiple seizure types, and those types wax and wane. So for periods of time, they can have seizures of one type, and then for another period of time, seizures of another type. And to compound that even further, you actually have individuals who have both what are called epileptic and non-epileptic seizures. So they have behavioral symptoms that are not due to hypersynchronous electrical activity, and some that are. And again, if you try to understand the brain simply by focusing in on a subset of these particular symptoms, you'll miss some things. And this is quite important, because very often when it comes to thinking about these sorts of challenges, the clinical problem is considered to be the gold standard. But even here, the human model has some limitations, and it's really important that we think carefully about what those limitations are, because that helps us decide on the appropriateness of the model. Now, similarly, we can go to mammals. So we might not be able to study the human condition, but we can look at different types of animal models, and there's been a lot of carefully characterized seizure models in rodents, and in particular idiopathic generalized epilepsies have been well characterized in 2 genetically inbred strains of rodent. One is called the Gares and one is called the Wag-Ridge. And they share many features in common. So for example, the behavioral symptoms in these rodents is quite similar to what you see in the human conditions. So with absences, you just have a brief period of time where the subject zones out for a few seconds and then comes back online. And you have a particular characteristic waveform, the spike wave discharge, where you get a spike and a slow wave and a spike and a slow wave, similar to what you see on this EEG next to this rodent here in the slide. But in the humans, that has a frequency of between 2 and 4 hertz, whereas in the rodent models, it's typically closer to 9 hertz. So although the behavioral symptoms are the same and some features of the electrographic activity are the same, there are some differences. And intriguingly, there are also differences in terms of the mechanisms by which these pathologies appear to arise. So in these different inbred strains, one of those strains, the pathological activity appears to have a specific start point in somatosensory cortex, whereas in the other strain, it appears to be due to an alteration in the connections of the brain at the large scale. So there's a loss of white matter connections transcallosally in one of these models. So they have different mechanisms giving rise to apparently similar features. So how these map onto what's observed in the human condition remains in part an unanswered question. And then, of course, there are computer models, the machine. Well, here we can use our knowledge or our prior beliefs about how certain features might emerge to define equations that we can use to computers to simulate and to try and understand how these different ingredients give rise to features of interest. For example, transitioning from a background state, apparently a healthy state, to a seizure-like state in the model. And we can use this information to make predictions about what type of epilepsy someone might have. Is it a generalized seizure where all of the pathological activity seems to emerge approximately simultaneously across the brain? Or is it more focal in origin, where there seems to be specific drivers of that activity, and the activity may remain localized or may spread? So the point here to make is that there are all these different types of model that we consider, and as George Box put it, that all models are wrong, but some are useful, or as today as Tarpey updated this, all models are right, but most are useless. So how do we find that sweet spot in the middle where our models actually have some validity? And for me, it's all about the questions that you're seeking to address. So unless you're able to really clearly define the challenge that you want to consider, it's actually really difficult to determine whether or not your model is useful or right or fit for purpose. And so that's something that we're going to try and consider quite carefully during the rest of the talk. So how do you build a model of the brain? Well, the brain is a very complex system, and just some of the basic stats immediately tell us that with 10 to the 12 neurons and each one forming 10 to the 4 connections on average, a bottom-up approach may not be the best one. That said, there are lots of projects that originally started their life believing that that could be a useful approach. If you think about the Human Brain Project, when it was originally funded, the idea was literally to build a model of the brain from the ground up and include every single piece of information that you possibly could. Again, my approach is slightly different. So I would argue that if your model ends up being of order complexity, the same order of complexity as the system that you're studying, then really you should just study the system, because your model is always going to miss features. And if you miss those features, they're likely to be critical or could be critical, and you'll have no way of actually a priori or a posteriori determining that because of the complexity of the model. But in our context, what I'm interested in is understanding diagnosis and prognosis of epilepsy. And as we mentioned, the EEG is a tool that's primarily used. And if you look at the activity collected through the EEG, it looks something like this. So at the time scale of, say, tens of minutes here, you're seeing that it just kind of looks like a noisy, steady state for large parts, interspersed with bursts of high amplitude activity. So as a mathematician, I kind of know about models, very simple models, that have that sort of behavior. And the one that I might choose to start with is, the canonical form of a subcritical Hock bifurcation. So this is a relatively simple mathematical model. I'm not sure of all of your backgrounds here. So if some of you are coming from a more clinical background, you may already look at this equation and think this looks quite complicated. But from a more mathematical perspective, this sort of normal form or canonical model is the simplest way I can write down a system that behaves in a certain way. And its behavior is essentially very similar to the dynamics that I observe in that EEG, i.e. it permits simultaneously the coexistence of two states, a steady state and a high amplitude state. And if I drive the system with a noise term, then I can be kicked from one of those states to another past a separatrix. Now, of course, with EEG, as I mentioned, it's not just a single channel of data. There are actually, up to 256 electrodes that some studies would use. Typically, clinically, it's more like 20, possibly 32, but the most standard clinical ones are around 20 channels. And those electrodes are each really recording the aggregated activity of around 10 to the 6 to 10 to the 9 neurons. So if I want to build up this model of lots of channels, well, I say I need a big mathematical model, but actually it looks quite like the smaller one. It's just that I'm introducing an adjacency matrix M that tells me whether or not two regions of the brain, as defined by these electrodes, has a connection or not. And I can choose different ways of determining that. I could just study this theoretically and just make the decision myself, or I could infer that from the data. So there are a number of techniques for determining what's called the functional connectome. So basically looking at the statistical interdependencies between EEG channels and using that information to decide whether there is a connection between one channel and the other. And I can use that to inform this matrix of connections, and that helps me to build a bigger mathematical model. But roughly speaking, how this looks is like this. So we have this normal form, and it has this separatrix that essentially separates these coexisting states, so a steady state and the oscillatory state, that high amplitude state. And depending on the value of alpha, so alpha is essentially parameterizing a noise term, a little kick to the system at every time point. This determines how easy it is to be kicked over into the high amplitude state. So if you imagine that this lambda parameter at baseline is a measure of how excitable the brain is, with the idea being that the more excitable the brain is, the easier it is to transition to seizure. So if you look at it from the perspective of this separatrix, as I move across the separatrix, increasing lambda, the distance between the steady state and the separatrix shrinks, which means that I need less of a kick. So it means that entering the seizure state is more likely. So this model captures a kind of fundamental principle, if you like, that underpins our beliefs about how seizures start, which is that the brain being more excitable makes seizures or the seizure state more likely. But you've got to remember, this is a very phenomenological approximation. I mean, we are talking about the subcritical Hopf bifurcation here. I haven't included any details of physiology per se. They're all wrapped up in these parameterizations. But for the question that we're seeking to address, this may or may not be appropriate. Let's find out. So what we did back in the early 2010s was to introduce this concept of brain network ectogenicity. And sorry, I think I just paused there. Hopefully I'm back online. Sorry about that. Brain network ectogenicity. And the idea of this was a measure of the ability of a given dynamic network structure to generate seizures. So we took this simple model and we just said, okay, let's start off with a very simple brain. So perhaps my brain, it's only got 4 regions. We'll call them A, B, C, and D. And we'll put some arbitrarily defined network structure on that, and we'll set the system up so that it's got some arbitrary level of excitability in each region, and we'll simulate the model and we'll see what happens. And so for this particular choice of those parameterizations, we find here, this is what we might term a healthy brain. The BNI is low. We simulated the model for a long time and we didn't see any seizure-like events. So we'd say this is a healthy brain. But then if you just alter this brain very slightly, so everything's exactly the same, except for one thing. So in region B, I've made the excitability of that region ever so slightly bigger than the other regions. Apart from that, everything else is the same. But now if we look at the output of the model, we see that there are actually regular bursts of seizure-like activity. And what's particularly interesting is that these bursts occur simultaneously across all channels of the model. So this is what we would term a sort of generalized seizure, if you like. But interestingly, there's only one area with a pathology and everything else is normal. And then consider this example. So we're back to the original idea where our brain was healthy in panel A, but now this time we've just altered a connection. So there's no change in excitability per se. In each region, the lambda value was the same as it was in panel A, but we've removed the connection. And now what's interesting is that actually there are lots of bursts across all channels simultaneously. So here we might say the BNI is high because you're spending more time in the seizure-like state than not. But what's particularly intriguing is that, you know, we've achieved this by making the brain less connected and not more. So it goes back to some of those early experimental studies. If you recall, I mentioned in the animal studies of generalized discharges, there were these two competing ideas, one of which is that there was a pathological region in somatosensory cortex, and one of which was there was a loss of white matter connections transcallosally. And the model here shows that these are both consistent mechanisms that can explain the emergence of generalized type discharges. Bearing in mind that a lot of the nature of seizures is defined clinically through the semiology rather than from a mechanistic underpinning perspective. So both of these would be classed as generalized discharges, but the mechanism of origin is different in each case. And you can play this game in the context of focal discharges as well. So we start with a slightly different network structure and make one region, region B, slightly pathological by increasing its excitability relative to the other regions. And we find that in this case, we get what we might expect from the classical understanding. We just see pathology in region B predominantly. You can kind of see a few bursts of activity in region B. But again, you can play the game where actually you keep everything the same. So each region is not pathological in the sense that they all have the same level of excitability, but just by changing the connectivity slightly, removing an edge, all of a sudden region B is generating bursts frequently. And again, that's quite important because in the context of, say, surgery, you might be looking to remove a region that you hypothesize to be pathological, which in the case of panel D may make sense because region B is pathological. But in the case of panel E, it doesn't make sense. So region B looks pathological when you study the data, but in terms of the brain that generated the data, actually what was pathological was the network alteration rather than a specific brain region. So I guess the key message here is that subtle changes in these network structures and the functional dynamics within each region can have a significant influence on emergent seizure likelihood. And if you're trying to understand epilepsy by studying these emergent dynamics, then that's a really important thing to be aware of. So how does this work in the context of epilepsy diagnosis? So essentially what we do is we use short seizure-free EEG epochs to reconstruct patient-specific representations of the brain. So you have this clinical recording, and this might be in a first seizure clinic, 15 or 20 minutes long, and you don't see anything in it that's indicative of whether or not the subject has epilepsy. So what we do is we take these short segments and we use those to construct the functional connectome, and that functional connectome informs our computer model. And then we can simulate the computer model under lots of different conditions very, very quickly on a computer, and we can understand how easy are seizure-like dynamics emerging from this model under these different representations. And so the output of the model is effectively a person-specific proxy of the EEG. So if you wanted to collect a year's worth of EEG from the human, obviously it would take you a year, and that would be very time consuming. And then you've got to analyze all that data, which is even more time consuming. Alternatively, you can generate lots and lots of simulations very, very quickly on the computer and use those to inform what you believe to be the risk of future seizures. And you can use this to give us a marker, which we call the BioEP marker or the Biomarker of Epilepsy. And you can take lots of these simulations from people with epilepsy and without epilepsy, and you can use this to understand what sorts of score should you give to determine whether the risk of future seizures is low, medium, or high. And so you might decide that, low is a value below 0.4 and high is a value above 0.6. And you can use this information to understand where the specific individual who you're considering lies in the distribution of cases of epilepsy and not epilepsy. And in some of the studies that we've undertaken, we've just considered this as a standalone diagnostic in publications. So this isn't how we'd envisage this being used clinically, but it's a way of kind of testing the performance of the algorithm against the clinical state of the art. So the sorts of results we find are that you can now get, accuracy of around 79% using these algorithms, just using 20 seconds of data. And contrasting that with the accuracy of the entire clinical pathway, which is essentially take as many EEGs, as many other diagnostic tests as you need, take all of the clinical case history, all of that evidence from different sources, and take as long as you need to reach the point at which you're comfortable with the diagnosis. And that pathway achieves an accuracy of around 72%. So as one of our clinical colleagues puts it, this approach isn't a magic bullet, it's not getting things right 100% of the time, but it's actually giving an uplift to the diagnostic process at the start of the journey that is better than you can achieve through the current journey as it is. And so this is why we're very confident that this sort of approach can add value. Now, another really interesting piece of work we've been undertaking is to explore the change in this marker as a result of putting people on anti-epilepsy drugs. So with collaborators down in Melbourne, we've been looking at individuals who have a confirmed diagnosis of epilepsy, get put on drugs, and then have an EEG taken a period of time later on. And what's really interesting in this pilot data is that the value of this marker changes, and it statistically significantly decreases in cases where the AEDs were shown to reduce seizures, whereas it doesn't in cases where there was no reported effect of the AED by the individual. And this again is really interesting because it tells you, similar to, say, for example, the PSA, the prostate-specific antigen, which is a biomarker of prostate cancer, that once you've got a diagnosis of prostate cancer, the PSA becomes a really effective marker for determining how you're responding to treatment. So you get put on, for example, anti-androgen therapy, so hormone therapy. And if that therapy is effective, your PSA level shrinks an awful lot compared to the baseline. And that's really sort of similar sort of finding to what we observe here, that you get this reduction in the BioEP score should you respond effectively to medication. Now, we shouldn't just take our word for this, and we should be perhaps slightly critical on ourselves. And this was a study that came out earlier this year from a group based at King's College London and also at Great Ormond Street, where they carried out a systematic review of resting state methods for the diagnosis of both idiopathic epilepsies and psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. And as you'll see from the right, this is a table of the studies that survived to be included in their systematic review. And I've highlighted the ones that are related to our group. And it's important to highlight that because of the nature of many of these studies, there is risk of bias in how the patients were selected, and in particular in the flow and timing of the EEGs. So one of the things that they highlight is that, for example, many of the studies were considering just clearly epilepsy and clearly not epilepsy, which is not indicative of what you would see in a first seizure clinic. So you wouldn't go to a first seizure clinic if you had no history of having events that at least seemed like they might be seizures, for example, whereas many of these studies will do what's termed as a kind of diagnostic phase 1 study. You see whether you can distinguish the clearly afflicted from the clearly well. The flow and timing is also important because, as I mentioned, many people have multiple EEGs, and it's not always clear in these studies where in that diagnostic pathway those EEGs were collected. So were they collected at the first EEG, or were they collected at the point that a diagnosis was made? And there may have been something specific in that EEG at the point of diagnosis was made that essentially is just getting pulled out by your algorithm. And if you can see that from the data anyway clinically, then your algorithm is not really going to be useful from a decision support perspective. So what we've been doing recently is actually undertaking a study sponsored by the NIHR, where we're actually looking to ensure that the population that we're considering best reflects the case rates that might be seen in a first seizure clinic. So we worked with partners across the country to understand the ratios of cases in terms of idiopathic epilepsies, focal epilepsies, non-epileptic attack disorder, syncopes, others, that would come through those centres, and ensure that the population that we're actually applying the algorithms to respects the makeup of that overall population. We're also ensuring in a retrospective study that we're collecting the longitudinal recordings and comparing the scores at each of those stages, all first EEGs, all follow-up EEGs, etc., to overcome this issue of, are we only selecting the EEG at which point a diagnosis was made, as opposed to earlier on in the system, so that we can effectively determine the value added there. And we're also ensuring that the diagnosis is stable as much as it can be possible. So this is a retrospective analysis. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, there's a lot of challenges around misdiagnosis in epilepsy, which means that your gold standard can be affected very greatly if that misdiagnosis rate is high. So to control for that, we're saying that the diagnosis needed to have been stable for at least 12 and preferably 24 months post the final EEG, at which point the diagnosis was originally made. And so we're undertaking that study at the moment and hoping to publish the findings early next year. But just to give you an idea, I guess, for an analogy of why the approach we're proposing is kind of fundamentally different. So imagine you're the driver of this van and you feel there's something wrong, you know, your brakes don't seem to be terribly effective, and you go to the mechanic, and rather than the mechanic having a look at your tires or having a look at your brake wear, the mechanic says, I just want you to drive down the road so I can see what happens. And either nothing happens, in which case the mechanic says, I'm not sure, or you smash into the car in front, in which case the mechanic says, I think there might be a problem with your brakes. Well, that's life for people with suspected epilepsy, because at the moment, there is no effective measure of brake pad wear or tire tread. And so the only way that a diagnosis of epilepsy can definitively be made is to observe that seizure, the crash. I mean, that's pretty archaic when you think about it, and not how you would approach diagnosis in other conditions. So for example, in diabetes, we wouldn't wait until the point that your foot's gone gangrenous and we need to amputate it before realizing that your blood sugars are really high. I mean, there are still cases where that happens, but there is actually a diagnostic test, the blood biomarker HbA1c, that can determine, you know, whether we should treat you as if having diabetes. And the reason for doing that is because statistically, we know that the risk of complications grows exponentially above a certain value relative to baseline. And therefore, we need to treat you as if having diabetes at that point. And this is where we want to get to with BioEP and epilepsy. So we know that above a certain value of the BioEP marker, the risk of future seizures is such that we should treat you as if having epilepsy, even though we haven't actually waited for you to have that seizure event. And that's important because it only takes one seizure event for a fatality to occur. As I mentioned, over 2,000 people die each year, and many others have life-altering consequences as a result of their seizures. And so actually waiting for people to have seizures in order to confirm diagnosis is not a great strategy in our opinion. So that's sort of what we've been doing in terms of the company side, and alongside the BioEP report, which gives us this risk of future seizures from EEG, we've also been developing a home monitoring system which enables you to collect data that's clinically relevant in managing the condition, alongside the ability to record EEG in the home environment for the prognostic piece. And in terms of where we're at with the commercial development, well, we've CE marked the first version of the BioEP platform. It's a class 1 medical device under the MDR, the medical device regulations, which we registered back in May. So it's a cloud-based system, works in Microsoft Azure. It's got data infrastructure and security standards that meet NHS requirements, and essentially enables a clinician to upload an EEG. The EEG is then analysed, and a report is prepared that is sent back that gives essentially the risk of future seizures for this particular individual, which the clinician can then use in conjunction with all the other history, all the other information they have to decide what's the most appropriate next step. Is it a diagnosis of epilepsy? Is it a future test? Is it a cross-referral to a psychologist if you think this might be a case of non-epileptic attack disorder? These choices are available. We're currently, through NIHR support, developing a second version of the product that will be FDA approved, 510K approved in order to be used in the US, and also CE marked as a Class 2A device. And the plan is that will happen by the end of next year. So just to give you a bit of an idea of how we got that far. So a lot of the research I talked about, well, it began back in 2012, continued on until the present day. But it was only around 2015-16 that we began to think about the commercial possibilities of this, the translational potential of these algorithms. And we took part in a process called ICURE, or Innovation to Commercialization of University Research. And Wes basically spent 3 months traveling the globe, meeting many different stakeholders who would be interested in this potential technology, to understand from them what their pain points were, what the potential was, whether there were any other questions that we weren't thinking about that could be addressed. And that was really useful because it really helped shape what they call the value proposition, to understand the translational potential of these underpinning research tools. And then in 2017, we had a couple of successes. We were recognized by the Epilepsy Foundation of the USA as a product that had potential to impact on the lives of people with epilepsy. And we were also awarded a grant from Innovate UK through their Health and Life Sciences scheme that was enabled us to develop a prototype of this BioEP clinical platform. Now, it took a long time to establish the company, and one of the lessons learned, I would say, is I'm not sure what it's like in Cyprus, but in the UK, universities tend to operate at quite slow timescales. They tend to like to take quite a while to make decisions. And so it took quite a long time to get all the ingredients in place to incorporate the company, that in turn enabled us to take up that grant. It was over a year from when the offer letter came to when we were able to take it up. And then we were trundling along for that first year or so, making fairly slow progress, I think it's reasonable to say. And then the pandemic hit, which perversely actually provided us with a lot more opportunities. We were actually able to secure additional funding from the UK government that really enabled us to accelerate our product development and got us into a position where the technology we had began to be recognised from first national and then international bodies. So we were awarded a startup award by, first of all, Medilink Southwest, and then we were the Medilink National Startup of the Year. And earlier this year, Nature recognised the potential of the BioEP technology, and we were a finalist in the SpinOff competition, which is a competition run in partnership between Nature and Merck. And that enabled us to complete a seed funding round, and that in turn has helped us to grow the company, both in the science and clinical team, but also in the technology and commercial side of things. So if you can see from this slide here, just to give you a brief idea of where we're at, you can see that we've had a very rapid period of growth in the last 12 months or so, and we're hoping to continue that growth moving forwards. So listen, I hope that's given you a useful overview of some of the work we've been undertaking. If you want to find out more about the underpinning science, there's a whole list of references here that sort of go back from that early work in 2012 that introduced the concept of BNI to very recent work that looks at how you can use these measures to determine whether seizures are focal or generalized. And as I mentioned, as part of the SpinOff prize, we were actually profiled in Nature. This is a special digital issue that you can download for free, which gives you quite a nice overview as to what we're up to at Neuronostics and how our technology works. So listen, thanks so much for listening, and really happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Terry, for your talk, and especially for your industrial aspect to your research, because this is something that we're trying to do as well, engage with industry. Obviously, we're not going to start a company. well, we may. Okay, if there's any questions for Professor Terry, please raise your hands. Spiros, go ahead, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
That was a very nice talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions that are closely related. So my question is, the first question has to do with the dynamical models that you use. You use one dynamical model that shows bifurcations, and that's the basic ingredient that you want. But you know, there exist other models, Wilson-Cowan, you know, epileptor models, and you can have, it seems that you can have a large variety of dynamical models as long as they give you some sort of bistability. And they could, in principle, all be useful in the type of project that you have. And a related question, and so my question is this true? And a related question, which I couldn't get from the talk because there was no time to explain it, is that each model, like, for example, in your model, the critical parameters that bring about, you know, the bifurcated state and the noise parameters, these parameters, of course, are phenomenological. So when you actually use a model and then take the EEG measurements and create a functional network and apply the model, how do you fit these parameters? And these are the two questions that are related, I suppose, just for.
Yeah, brilliant questions. So I didn't, as you identify, spend too much time thinking about different types of model, and you're absolutely right. There are many different types of model of the brain, you know, some of which have validity, some of which may not have validity. And I think you're right to consider it in terms of the ingredients that they have. So there are different, I guess, hypotheses about the origin of seizures. So is it that the seizure state coexists with non-seizure states, in which case a bistability type mechanism is important? Is it that the seizure state bifurcates out of a background state, in which case the bifurcation model is important? Is it that both could explain different parts of an individual's seizure semiology? Or could there be other mechanisms? So, for example, people have proposed intermittency or chaos as possible, you know, mechanisms of seizures. So I guess for me, and from the perspective I would bring to it, is that, you know, the model should be as simple as it can be, but no more simple. So we start with these very simple phenomenological representations, such as the subcritical hop, and see how far they get us. And we have, over time, made those models more complicated. So, for example, we might make the lambda parameter dynamic rather than just purely a static parameter in response to data that we have generated that suggests that excitability varies depending on time of day, for argument's sake. You know, that's a sort of extension we've made. We haven't personally studied, say, something like the epilepsy model, which the creators would describe as, I guess, a more physiological representation because it was inferred more directly from data. I always come at this from a perspective that actually all of these models are really phenomenological at some description. So sure, they have parameters that you think are related to excitation or inhibition, but actually you can relate or infer parameters of any of these models from data, as we do, and this sort of leads into the second part of your question. But actually they're not really, I guess, physiological in the sense that perhaps in an engineering example, you could sort of say, well, I'm using first principles to define the equations that describe this building or this helicopter. Right. You can't really do that in the brain in quite the same way. So I would sort of say that really all models are phenomenological, and they just have increasing levels of complexity to capture certain fundamental properties, which are typically bifurcations or bistability. Now, in terms of the second part of your question, how do we infer these parameters? Well, we use statistical methods such as the phase locking factor or time-lagged cross-correlation to infer whether or not there are connections between regions. And we also use properties of the signal itself in terms of its amplitude and the subtle changes in frequency to determine the dynamic parameters within each node of the model. And that's sort of how we calibrate parameters from the clinical data in order to get a patient-specific representation of the brain.
Okay, so to conclude, you would say that this, at the level of these phenomenological models, I cannot take one of my critical parameters and say, you know, if I give you these drugs, for example, you change, you cannot really associate the critical parameter with a physiological.
I think that's interesting because you could say, for example, use a Wendling type model where you have different populations of neurons and you have parameters that sort of describe excitation and inhibition within neural populations. And you might be able to argue that, you know, the action of AEDs, anti-epilepsy drugs, broadly either dampens excitability or increases inhibition with a view to trying to reduce overall excitability. And in those sorts of models, you could potentially ask questions like, is there evidence to support changes in the parameters corresponding to those mechanisms when giving drugs of particular types? And there has been some research that looks at that sort of question.
One little final question. With this very nice work you showed, your initial work in 2012, where you had this network model and you played both with connectivity and local excitation. Could I conclude that actually in epilepsy, I cannot make a generalization, like epilepsy is due to lack of connectivity, let's say loss of connectivity, because you showed that with a given connectivity, you know, an excitation, a local excitation can also lead to the same phenomenology. So in a sense, there is not a generic, let's say, mechanism like criticality or something that, you know, from a physicist point of view, people would.
Yeah.
You cannot say that. Yeah.
So I would say that on average, you could conclude from some of those studies that loss of connections makes the seizure-like state more achievable. And we actually, for example, I think in our 2012 paper, the reference 11 on this page, we actually looked at all possible combinations of 4-node networks. So 216 different combinations from memory. And on average, if you remove the connection versus adding a connection to each starting network, you are more likely to see an increase in seizure-like behavior for removing a connection than adding it. But there were some networks for which adding connections made seizures more likely. So it's not quite as straightforward as that. You're also absolutely right that it's an interplay between, for a given network structure, what is the level of excitability in each region, and also how the noise term comes in, and in particular, you know, not only the amplitude, but you could argue the type of noise as well may play a role. So it becomes quite a complex, multi-dimensional space to unpack.
Okay, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Professor Scottis. Vangeli, you're up next.
Yes, thanks. Thank you very much, John. It was really very exciting, all the discussion, I mean, the presentation of the model, but also about the company. Just a follow-up, let's say, question. So at some point, if I'm not wrong, you saw some data about the diagnostic and the clinical pathway accuracy of the models. So can you please just first, let's say, explain a little bit the difference? And second, if I remember well, the numbers were around 80%, between 70 or 80%, in some cases even lower. Is this something, let's say, acceptable from the clinical point of view or not?
Yes, I guess the important thing to point out is that we don't envisage this being used as a standalone diagnostic. So we're not trying to get the thing to predict accurately yes, no. Rather, we're expecting it to be used as a decision support tool. So it would be a piece of information that is provided to the clinician in addition to everything else that happens. So imagine at the moment, you take your first EEG and it's clinically negative. The next stage might be to bring the person in a few weeks later for either a sleep-deprived EEG, where you've asked them to stay up overnight and come in first thing in the morning, or some centres might move you straight to a 24-hour recording in a clinic. Alternatively, if you've got this negative EEG, but our report comes back and says that either this is a high risk of epilepsy or alternatively it's a low risk and it looks like possibly non-epileptic attack disorder, then you can actually decide to pivot either straight to longer term monitoring if you think it's likely to be a case of epilepsy, or to cross-refer to a psychologist if you think it's, say, a non-epileptic attack disorder, or to a cardiologist if you think it's a syncope, in order to reach the diagnosis quicker than you would otherwise reach. Because otherwise, you imagine you've got to go through this sequential process of longer EEGs before you see something in those EEGs that indicates one of these other conditions. And, you know, the real challenge is this non-epileptic attack disorders, because there is no electrical manifestation of the condition, yet the symptoms seem really like seizures. So these are the ones that people are often having to monitor for long periods of time over many years before they conclude that actually this is a different condition to epilepsy. And if you were able to actually identify with confidence that this was likely to be a non-epileptic attack disorder very early on, you could take remedial steps immediately to begin to address that pathway, for example. So the actual specific level of accuracy as a standalone diagnostic is perhaps not what is the most important measure of how the tool gets used, but it's rather used collectively with everything else. What do outcome measures such as time to diagnosis, overall accuracy of diagnosis, objectivity of decision-making look like? They're kind of the key ingredients, I feel.
So is this related with the different metrics? So if I'm not wrong, there you report 3 different metrics. This SEN, so are these different metrics correspond?
Sorry, so these are just sensitivity and specificity of the algorithm. So essentially, how many true positives, how many true negatives does the algorithm get? But bearing in mind the actual real system.
So these are a standard error 1 and error 2, let's say, in statistical.
Yeah. But remember, of course, the true positive and true negative has come at the end of a long journey. Whereas at the time you've taken, say, the first EEG, if there was follow-up EEGs, this would mean that actually the outcome at that EEG clinically was unclear. So actually one of the things we do as well is extend this concept so that we don't just consider yes, no, but we also consider the level of certainty around the prediction you're making, which again is more in keeping with how the clinical journey would work.
So is it important, let's say, to improve these numbers, or it's already fine? I mean,
I guess the proof will be in the prospective pudding, right? So we hopefully in the next 12 months will be moving into a prospective study of the use of the technology as a decision support tool, and there we will get a full understanding of how some of these measures are impacted. So that's, I guess, where we'll really find out where the added value comes from, because statistically it's, you know, we've had conversations, we've got quite a big statistical clinical trials unit here in Birmingham. We've had a number of conversations about how you design studies to measure clinical decision support, because we kind of naively assumed this would be an easy thing to do. But actually it's really quite a challenging area to measure the impact of something that is not a definitive diagnostic, but rather augments an existing pathway, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you very much again, John.
Thank you, Vangeli. Panayota, you're next.
Hi, thanks a lot for a great talk. I've got several questions. One is about this lambda parameter that you had. Do you have different lambdas for different types of seizures? Can you have different ones?
Depends how you want to set the model up. You can infer an approximation of the lambda parameter from the data if you believe certain a priori assumptions that may or may not have validity. You could choose all the lambdas to be the same in each region. You could assume they were distributed around some median value, for example. So you have some control over what those lambda parameters are. As I showed, I guess, in the slide with the different panels, kind of classically, you would assume that a focal onset seizure corresponded to a lambda that was pathological in the region where the focus was. And that looked a bit like the panel D that I put up. Whereas, a generalized discharge would be due to some change in connectivity, which was a bit like the panel C I put up. But as we saw, actually, it's much more complicated than that. And it's really the interplay between what the network structure was and what the values of the lambdas are that determines whether seizures appear focal or generalized. And those mechanisms are likely to be really quite important depending on the clinical question you're trying to address. So, for example, in the context of surgery, if you had some network disruption, so all the regions aren't actually pathological in the way you would classically expect it, then just using the dynamics of the signal is probably not a good one for determining whether or not you should resect that particular region of the brain.
Thank you. And also, so you take parts of the EEG when there is no seizure. In the traditional way of diagnosing epilepsy, can clinicians actually use that part to diagnose epilepsy? Because it's quite hard to diagnose it. Are there any markers that the traditional clinician?
Yeah, so essentially what you're looking for in the EEG when you're making a diagnosis are kind of signatures of seizures. So typically what are called interictal epileptiform discharges. So these might be spikes. They could be brief discharges, and occasionally you might capture a seizure, but that's pretty unlikely. And they're the features that are being used clinically to determine epilepsy, or determine this is likely to be a case of epilepsy alongside everything else. But there are some caveats to that. First of all is that these features don't occur in about 70% of first EEGs that are recorded. So if you a priori knew the cases of epilepsy, around half of those cases would display an abnormality in their first EEG, but half wouldn't. And obviously the vast majority of cases without epilepsy wouldn't display any abnormality because they don't have epilepsy. But I say vast majority deliberately there because there's fairly robust evidence that shows around 1 in 40 people display, for example, spike wave type activity on the EEG, even though they don't have epilepsy. So it's not a very sensitive marker, and it doesn't have great specificity either. So that's the real kind of challenge when it comes to just using the easily observable features, if you like, of the EEG in making a diagnosis.
What was AED that you have?
AED, sorry, that was anti-epilepsy drugs, sort of therapy that
Okay.
people are put on. Sorry about that.
I was wondering how do absent seizures look like? Because are they similar to all the other different kinds of seizures? I mean, I understand that like a generalized seizure, you would see spikes happening in all the electrodes. The focal ones you might see in some of the electrodes, but are the absent seizures different, or?
So absent seizures are essentially a class of generalized discharge. So you would see pathological activity pretty much in every channel, pretty much simultaneously. Again, I deliberately use these qualifiers because actually if you kind of zoom in on data, you can actually often see one channel seems to lead others by a few milliseconds. But, in terms of how you would clinically interpret it, it looks like all channels simultaneously. And the behavioural semiology of the absence is very much captured in terms of the brief pause. So where someone goes offline and comes back online. And those of us who have young children will probably understand, therefore, why it's actually quite difficult to capture absences, because young kids often do daydream, so they seem to just zone out and just be totally away with the fairies, and nothing seems to snap them out of it, and then they all of a sudden snap out of it. And, you know, very often this is how absences ultimately get, you know, found out, that these kids begin to fall behind at school, and their teachers accuse them of not paying attention, and, you know, have the parents in and say, look, you know, your child's really not paying attention in class. And it turns out that they're having, you know, absences. And absences are one of these epilepsies where without treatment, you can have, you know, dozens to hundreds a day. So it can be quite debilitating, but treatable in the large majority of cases.
Treatable with anti-epileptic drugs.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
Banayoda, do you have anything else?
Well, my last question was, so the other alternative to epilepsy is the non-epileptic attack disorder, and then there was another one that you mentioned.
Yeah, syncope is another common alternative. So syncope is basically fainting induced by often a cardiac related condition. So sort of fluctuations in your heart leads to, you know, changes in oxygen levels to the brain and blood flow to the brain that results in fainting that can seem like seizures, because it effectively mimics like a drop attack. And that's another common differential diagnosis to epilepsy.
The non-epileptic attack disorder, you said that the EEG looks similar to epilepsy?
No, so there will be no electrical. So if you capture one of these events in, say, video telemetry, so you've got EEG and video simultaneously, you'll see behaviourally, like the person will often be shaking and will have collapsed to the floor, and it will look very much like a generalised tonic-clonic seizure, but there would be no electrographic abnormality whilst this is going on. So this is, the non-epileptic attack disorder is kind of hypothesized to be more of a psychological condition and is often induced by exposure to extreme stress.
Thank you very much. That's all.
Pleasure.
And I would like to ask a question. I was wondering if there's a possibility of adding any machine learning algorithms inside your models, but from all the conversation that you had, I guess there's not enough data to train such a model, or the inputs to such will be challenging, given that there's 30 or so sensors on the EEG, and that is temporal, meaning that it changes over time.
Yeah. Now, there are opportunities. One of the things I would say, though, as a word of caution when it comes to the sort of idea that you could just take machine learning algorithms and, you know, solve the problem pretty quickly, is what's your gold standard? As we mentioned before, the misdiagnosis rates in epilepsy can be very, very high. So, you know, the construction of your database is something that's really important. Also, in the context of decision support, as I mentioned, there's a whole range of other features that are being used in the process of epilepsy diagnosis, a very holistic process. EEG is one component, case history, eyewitness accounts, etc., all playing an important role. And so there are opportunities to use machine learning to actually, you know, assimilate over all the other information that's being collected in order to improve the accuracy, if you like, of the recommendation of the marker. And I think that's, you know, that's something that we're actively looking at as a possibility. So I think it's very much important to remember that you need to be able to explain why your markers are making the predictions they are, in order, certainly in the UK, to be compliant with codes of conduct relating to the use of AI/machine learning in healthcare. And so it is important, I feel, to have that underpinning mathematical model because that does give you the explainability, if that makes sense.
It does, yes. Thank you. So if there's any other final questions for Professor Terry, please let us know now. It appears not, in which case I would like to thank you very much for today's talk. Thank you all for joining. Professor Terry may give us his presentation that will be online, because I see there's a lot of references and links that we can follow up, and you know, that Nature article, and I think there was something that we could try, you said, free. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll get the slides over to you.
Okay, and we'll look it up. Again, thank you all for joining. Most especially thank you to Professor Terry, and we'll see you in our next seminars.
Thanks
Bye,
so much,
everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.